Welcome to Silent Secrets. I'm your host for tonight's mystery. Today's tale begins with a quiet moment, a simple knock, a forgotten letter, and a truth that was never meant to be discovered. Chapter 1. The Country House. The café smelled faintly of cinnamon, a subtle aroma that lingered in Poirot's memory like a delicate prelude to a symphony. He had been seated near the window, a small cup of steaming coffee before him, watching the late afternoon shadows lengthen over the cobbled streets. The winter evening had settled with its customary quietude, blanketing London in a brittle hush, yet Poirot's mind was already far from the city, travelling along country lanes to a manor house perched on the outskirts of Hampshire. The house, known as Ashcombe Hall, was a grand structure, a testament to a bygone era of English elegance. Its FAA, dressed in frost, laden ivy, glowed in the light of chandeliers and tall windows, each pane a tiny portal into a world of anticipation. The estate was surrounded by snow, covered gardens, topiary forms stiffened by winter's breath, their sculpted shapes casting intricate shadows on the pristine ground. A frozen fountain stood sentinel near the entrance, its marble basin reflecting the soft brilliance of lanterns hung along the path. Poirot's recollection of his journey to the house was precise. He remembered the steady rhythm of the carriage wheels, the crunch of snow beneath the hooves, and the muffled murmurs of villagers who recognized the family name but seldom saw its members. Arriving at the hall, he was greeted by the butler, Mr. Cranfield, a man whose stiff formality hid a sharp, calculating mind, a trait Poirot immediately appreciated. The butler's bow was near imperceptible, his smile courteous yet guarded, and his eyes, dark and watchful, suggested knowledge far beyond what his station implied. Inside, the hall was a symphony of light and warmth. Fireplaces roared in their stone hearths, casting flickering shadows that danced across walls hung with ancestral portraits. Heavy curtains framed tall windows, their velvet folds absorbing the winter's chill. The central hall, where guests would soon gather, smelled faintly of polished oak and the faint, almost imperceptible perfume of lilacs, likely placed to counteract the inevitable scent of smoke from the fires. Guests began to arrive, one after another, each introduced with the careful decorum of the upper echelons of society. There was Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, matriarch of the house, whose silver hair was pinned in an elegant coil and whose sharp eyes missed nothing. She welcomed her guests with a practiced charm, her voice soft yet commanding, exuding authority without ostentation. Beside her, her son, Reginald Ashcombe, tall and impeccably dressed, offered polite handshakes and courteous nods, though Poirot could detect a tension in his posture, a subtle stiffness that spoke of inner turmoil. Other guests included Mr. Julian Pritchard, a financier whose wealth was only rivaled by his vanity, Miss Clara Withers, a young socialite with an easy smile that seemed to mask her acute intelligence, Dr. Leonard Mills, a physician whose calm demeanor belied a sharp mind and a keen eye for human frailty, and Mrs. Agnes Worthington, a widow of considerable influence and even sharper gossiping skill. Each guest was carefully observed by Poirot, who, in the manner he always did, noted details invisible to the casual observer, the way Lady Eleanor's gloved hands trembled ever so slightly when she accepted a toast, the restless tapping of Reginald's foot beneath the table, the almost imperceptible curl of Miss Withers' lip as she scrutinized her companions. The house was filled with polite laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the soft strains of a string quartet playing in the adjoining drawing room. Yet beneath this veneer of civility, Poirot detected an undercurrent of unease. It was subtle, like the first tremor before an earthquake, a tension woven through glances and half-finished sentences, through silences pregnant with meaning. Even the servants, moving with quiet efficiency, carried an air of restrained apprehension, as though they too felt the invisible weight of anticipation. As midnight approached, the atmosphere grew taut. Guests gathered in the grand dining hall, a room adorned with frescoed ceilings, gilt mirrors, and a long mahogany table polished to perfection. Candles flickered in silver candelabras, casting a warm glow that softened the sharp edges of the room. Poirot, seated near the center, surveyed the assembly with meticulous attention. His little grey cells were already at work, examining interactions, noting the slightest inconsistencies in behavior, and cataloguing every detail that might later serve in unraveling the web of human motives and secrets. The first toast of the new year was to be proposed by Lady Eleanor. A crystal glass was raised, and the words were carefully chosen, measured, and elegant, to health, happiness, and the continuance of friendships old and new. Polite applause followed. Smiles were exchanged, and yet, as Poirot had anticipated, not all smiles were genuine. Behind the masks of civility, he could detect tension, a fragile thread connecting the assembled guests in a web of hidden desires, unspoken rivalries, and concealed grievances. Even as the laughter resumed and the conversation turned to safe topics, the weather, recent travels, and the latest theatre productions, Poirot's senses remained alert. The tiniest flicker of an eyebrow, the softest pause before a reply, the minuscule quiver of a hand, all spoke volumes. He noticed that Mr. Pritchard, despite his laughter, frequently checked his watch. Miss Withers subtly maneuvered to stand between certain guests, and Reginald Ashcombe avoided the gaze of Mrs. Worthington, whose knowing eyes seemed to search for vulnerabilities like a hawk. Poirot's mind, always alive to the nuances of human behavior, considered possibilities. Something was afoot in Ashcombe Hall. The festive evening, perfect on its surface, harbored undercurrents of discord, rivalries, and perhaps even danger. The meticulous arrangement of the household, the careful placement of guests, the subtle control exercised by Lady Eleanor, all suggested that she, too, sensed the delicate balance of tension within her home. Yet for what purpose, and who might upset it? As the final moments before midnight ticked away, Poirot reflected on the scene before him, a gathering of refined society, a house gleaming with elegance, and a night brimming with potential. And, in his ever-precise manner, he prepared himself for the inevitable unraveling of appearances, confident that the truth, however well concealed, would ultimately reveal itself to his little grey cells. The first chime of the new year would strike not merely as a celebration, but as the beginning of a mystery that would demand all his powers of observation, deduction, and insight. Even perfect smiles, he reminded himself, could hide unease. Chapter 2. Raising glasses, the dining hall shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, their prisms scattering light in delicate patterns across polished mahogany and gleaming silverware. The scent of fine wines and the faint sweetness of carefully prepared desserts mingled in the air, an invisible haze that spoke of celebration and anticipation. Guests, elegantly attired, moved gracefully between tables and chairs, each gesture measured, each smile carefully constructed. Yet Poirot, ever vigilant, perceived the subtler harmonies of human behavior, the rhythm of unease that underlay even the most practiced of social performances. Victor Langley, the host, stood at the head of the long dining table. His tailored suit clung perfectly to his form, the polished shoes reflecting the glow of the chandelier above. He raised a champagne flute, the golden liquid catching the light like captured sunlight. "A toast, dear friends," he began, voice warm but with a subtle edge, "to the health, prosperity, and happiness of each and every one gathered here this evening." The guests responded with polished politeness, their glasses rising in unison. There was Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, her posture impeccable. Lips curved in a refined smile, Reginald Ashcombe, whose eyes, though ostensibly cheerful, darted subtly to and fro, Mr. Julian Pritchard, whose hand shook imperceptibly as he held his glass, Miss Clara Withers, whose gaze lingered just long enough on certain companions to betray unspoken calculation, and Mrs. Agnes Worthington, whose knowing glances seemed to pierce the intentions of those around her. Poirot noted each motion with a meticulous eye, cataloguing the subtle deviations from habitual behavior, each one a potential piece in the intricate puzzle awaiting him. As the first sip was taken, polite conversation resumed. Words flowed like a stream over smooth stones. Safe topics, careful compliments, innocuous remarks. But beneath the surface, currents of tension and hidden agendas twisted and collided. Poirot, ever attentive to the psychological texture of a gathering, sensed the fractures in this polished veneer. Victor Langley's smile, broad and gracious, though it appeared, did not fully reach his eyes. They flickered ever so slightly, betraying a hidden apprehension. Poirot, watching closely, observed the micro-expressions that so often reveal truths the tongue dares not utter. Was Victor worried about a rival, a secret exposure, or an unresolved grievance among his guests? Poirot could not yet be certain, but he filed the observation away in the careful compartments of his mind. It was not long before whispers began to circulate, subtle and carefully modulated, so that only those nearby could catch their drift. Mrs. Worthington, who had always possessed the keenest sense of social and moral landscapes, leaned toward Reginald and murmured something that caused his eyes to widen imperceptibly. Miss Withers, noticing this exchange, arched an eyebrow ever so slightly, her lips tightening in a practiced expression of curiosity. Each movement, each reaction, became for Poirot a clue, a puzzle piece that hinted at relationships and tensions far more intricate than polite conversation might reveal. As the champagne flowed, the ceremonial aspect of the toast transitioned into something far more revealing. Glasses clinked again, laughter punctuated the air, yet certain gestures betrayed inconsistency. Mr. Pritchard, for instance, raised his glass with perfect formality, yet his hand trembled faintly as he lowered it. A subtle observation, one perhaps unnoticed by others, but Poirot's little grey cells registered it immediately. A man hiding discomfort, anxiety, or perhaps guilt. Poirot's gaze swept across the table to observe the interactions further. Lady Eleanor conversed with Mrs. Worthington in quiet tones, but their voices, though soft, carried sharp undertones that betrayed not friendship, but negotiation, perhaps even rivalry. Reginald, meanwhile, made fleeting eye contact with no fewer than 3 guests, each glance loaded with unsaid words and unacknowledged tension. Even the servants, moving with practiced efficiency to refill glasses and deliver delicacies, seemed unusually watchful, their heads turning more frequently than etiquette would normally dictate. And then, as if orchestrated by some invisible conductor, the moment arrived when the last drink was poured. A sparkling champagne flute, brighter than the rest, was delivered to Victor Langley himself. Poirot noted the faint hesitation in Victor's hand as he accepted it. Perhaps a simple formality, perhaps a subtle premonition, or perhaps a deliberate distraction. Every detail, no matter how minute, was significant in Poirot's methodical mind. The toast began anew, to the year ahead. Victor proclaimed, and glasses rose again. This time, the movement carried weight, eyes lingered, and Poirot caught the slight stiffening of Mr. Pritchard's posture, the faint tightening of Miss Withers' jaw, and the subtle narrowing of Lady Eleanor's gaze. One guest, though Poirot could not yet identify which, was not toasting to joy. Their expression, so carefully composed, did not reach the eyes, and the inconsistency triggered Poirot's suspicions. The room, illuminated by candlelight, and the golden glow of chandelier crystals, seemed suddenly charged with something unspoken, a tension that hovered above the polished surfaces and fine fabrics. Conversation faltered in fragments, laughter became a touch too sharp, and small gestures. The brushing of a hand against a table, the subtle straightening of a collar spoke volumes. Poirot observed it all with calm precision, understanding that beneath the surface of this genteel gathering lay motives, grievances, and secrets waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Victor raised his glass once more, this time in a quieter, almost private toast. May truth and happiness walk together in the new year. It was a sentiment both noble and ambiguous. Poirot, with his innate understanding of human psychology, sensed that the words were perhaps directed at someone specific, a veiled acknowledgement of concealed intentions. The phrase lingered in the air, a subtle ripple in an otherwise polished pond of society, and Poirot made a mental note to investigate its implication. The last sip of champagne had been taken, yet the room remained suspended in a state of delicate imbalance. Poirot's eyes, sharp and unblinking, noted a movement out of place, a slight shift in Reginald's hand, a subtle glance exchanged between Miss Withers and Mrs. Worthington, and the faintest twitch at the corner of Mr. Pritchard's mouth. Each observation fed into Poirot's growing certainty. This evening, though outwardly festive, was poised on the cusp of something far more serious. Even the most celebratory of nights, Poirot reflected, could conceal intentions darker than anyone might imagine. The final drink, meant to symbolize joy and unity, had revealed more than anyone suspected. Someone in Ashcombe Hall did not toast to happiness. Someone had an agenda, carefully cloaked beneath smiles and polite conversation, and Poirot, as always, was determined to uncover it. The little grey cells began to work in earnest, assembling fragments of observation into patterns, weighing each gesture and anticipating the ripple of consequences that would inevitably follow. For in the elegant dance of human interaction, no secret remained hidden forever, and Poirot understood that the toast was not merely ceremonial. It was the overture to a mystery that demanded resolution, a puzzle whose pieces would soon fall into place with the precision of a master conductor's hand. And thus, as glasses were set aside and murmurs resumed, a subtle undercurrent of suspense threaded through the room. The celebration, though outwardly perfect, was now charged with quiet tension. Each guest, knowingly or not, had revealed a fragment of their inner truth, and Poirot, with his unerring instinct and meticulous reasoning, was poised to discern the whole. For in the country house, amid laughter and clinking glasses, one truth remained clear. The last drink had spoken, and the tale it told was only beginning. Chapter 3. A sudden fall. The clock struck 12 with a sonorous chime, each note resonating through the lofty ceiling of Ashcombe Hall, echoing faintly across the polished floors and ornate walls. Guests raised their glasses once more, the fragile tinkle of crystal forming a delicate symphony that celebrated the arrival of the new year. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed suspended in a perfect golden frame, the glow of candlelight, laughter lightly brushing the air, and the warmth of festive anticipation embracing every corner of the room. Poirot, seated near the center of the dining table, had just allowed himself a satisfied sip of the champagne, his eyes ever alert, scanning the room for inconsistencies and subtle shifts in behavior. Each movement, each flutter of an eyelid, spoke to him with the clarity of a whispered confession. He noted that Mr. Pritchard, who had been unusually fidgety earlier, now straightened his shoulders as if determined to suppress whatever unease clung to him. Lady Eleanor's eyes glimmered with a cautious delight, yet Poirot discerned a slight tautness in her jaw, a tension that betrayed her concern for matters unspoken. Then, suddenly, the tranquility shattered. A sharp exclamation pierced the ambient murmur of conversation. "Henry!" All eyes turned instinctively toward the source, and in that instant, chaos unfurled like a storm across a serene landscape. Henry Carlisle, a man of middle years with an air of quiet dignity and impeccable attire, had collapsed. His champagne flute slipped from his grasp, the delicate crystal tilting in slow motion before crashing against the floor, shards scattering like fallen stars. Liquid, golden and sparkling, pooled across the polished mahogany, reflecting the flickering candlelight in grotesque fragments. Guests rose as one, a tide of alarmed movement surging forward. Miss Withers gasped and clutched her pearls. Mrs. Worthington stepped hastily around the spill, her hands trembling as she sought to reach Henry. Reginald Ashcombe lunged, catching his father's arm in a protective reflex. Victor Langley's face had drained of color, his broad smile replaced by a mask of urgent concern. The room, once a temple of decorum, now thrummed with tension, voices overlapping in panic, calls for assistance, and scattered questions. Through it all, Poirot remained seated, observing. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, catalogued the scene with meticulous precision. Every tremor of a hand, every flicker of the eye, every subtle shift in stance provided him with information far more valuable than the noise of panic could offer. He noted that Henry's body had collapsed directly forward, a slight convulsion passing through his limbs as he fell. Yet there was no immediate cry of pain. Poirot's mind raced through possibilities, fainting, sudden illness, or, he frowned slightly, something more sinister. "Summon and fetch a doctor," Victor Langley called, his voice firm despite the tremor that betrayed his fear. Quickly, he must not be left alone. Dr. Leonard Mills, who had been quietly conversing with a neighboring guest, reacted instantly. He crossed the room with calm authority, moving between the panicked crowd with practiced efficiency. Kneeling beside Henry, he checked the man's pulse, his gloved fingers pressing gently yet decisively against the delicate vein at the wrist. Poirot watched every subtle gesture, every flicker of expression on Dr. Mills' face, reading signs that others would miss, the faint tightening of the doctor's lips, the ever so slight narrowing of his eyes, the pause in his examination before pronouncing words to calm the gathering. "He's fainted," Dr. Mills announced, voice even but not without undertone. "Likely exhaustion or shock. He'll recover quickly, provided he remains calm and warm." "Fainted," Miss Withers repeated, doubt and curiosity lacing her voice. "But he appeared perfectly well moments ago." There was nothing in his manner. Poirot, however, was not satisfied. He leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on the table, his gaze fixed upon Henry's motionless figure. Something about the collapse did not align with the explanation offered. The manner in which the body had dropped, the absence of preliminary warning, and the sudden convulsion he had noted, all suggested a more complex cause than mere faintness. His little grey cells began turning, assembling possibilities, testing each against the observed facts. Meanwhile, the other guests, still caught in the grip of residual panic, murmured among themselves. Lady Eleanor, regaining her composure, attempted to restore order. "Please, everyone, step back. Give him space. Mr. Carlisle needs calm." "Not chaos," she said, her voice firm yet measured, masking the unease that threatened to break through her cultivated elegance. Victor Langley, meanwhile, remained rooted near the head of the table, his hand still poised over the nearest decanter, as though frozen in hesitation. Poirot noticed the brief flicker of recognition in his eyes, the momentary acknowledgement that something in Henry's fall had unsettled him beyond the bounds of ordinary concern. Guests began to slowly retreat, though not without exchanged whispers and speculative glances. Mrs. Worthington, particularly, maintained a near-perceptive vigilance, her eyes scanning for any irregularity in the scene. Miss Withers, meanwhile, edged closer, ostensibly concerned. Yet Poirot discerned a calculating precision in her approach, as though she sought clues hidden in plain sight. Poirot's attention then returned to the body of Henry Carlisle. He noted the angle of the collapse, the subtle stiffness in the limbs, and the trajectory of the champagne glass as it fell. Each of these observations, innocuous to an ordinary eye, carried significance for him. The broken glass, the liquid pooling across the floor, and the slight smudge on Henry's cuff, all details to which Poirot attached mental tags, to be referenced later in his methodical reconstruction of events. And yet, as he observed, he could not ignore the small but significant behavioral cues exhibited by the surrounding guests. Mr. Pritchard, who had been excessively fidgety earlier, now avoided eye contact, his gaze shifting from Poirot to the floor, in an almost imperceptible attempt to mask agitation. Miss Withers' lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing with subtle calculation. Even Lady Eleanor's poised composure hinted at an inner tension, a recognition that the fall of Henry Carlisle might carry implications beyond mere health. Poirot, ever precise, allowed no action or reaction to escape his notice. His mind catalogued, sorted, and compared, aware that in these moments of apparent disorder, the truth often revealed itself in gestures, too fleeting for the unobservant to perceive. He noted the rhythm of breaths, the cadence of murmured reassurances, the tiny shifts in posture that betrayed concern, fear, or guilt. Every detail, he knew, was a thread in the intricate tapestry of human intention. As Henry Carlisle was gently lifted and guided to a more comfortable position near the fireplace, a quiet hush settled over the hall. The initial surge of alarm had ebbed, leaving a charged silence that was more telling than any outburst. Poirot, still observing, considered the broader picture, the suddenness of the fall, the tension rippling through the guests, the subtle inconsistencies in behavior. The incident was not merely a medical event. It was a revelation, a glimpse into concealed truths, and a first indicator that the harmony of Ashcombe Hall was more fragile than appearances suggested. The year had changed for Henry Carlisle in a heartbeat, and though he was yet unaware, So too had the equilibrium of the assembled guests shifted. Poirot, with his meticulous reasoning and acute powers of observation, recognized that the night's events would ripple far beyond this moment of shock. Every glance, every tremor, every subtle gesture was a clue, a fragment of a larger enigma, waiting for the steady illumination of his little grey cells. The first domino had fallen. Chapter 4. Locked in the Snow began in the early hours after Henry Carlisle's collapse, silent at first, almost delicate in its descent. Yet by the late evening, it had transformed into a relentless storm, blinding the roads and burying the countryside in a thick, gleaming blanket of white. Poirot, standing by a frost-lined window in the drawing-room, watched the world beyond Ashcombe Hall disappear beneath a soft, yet unyielding frost. The manor, grand and imposing, now appeared less as a sanctuary and more as a gilded cage. Outside, the wind howled across frozen gardens, rattling the tall windows and whipping the bare branches of trees against each other, in a violent, yet strangely rhythmic symphony. The storm had done what no hand or will could. It had sealed the estate from the outside world. No carriage could traverse the frozen lanes. No messenger could arrive. No help could be summoned, should it be needed. For those within, the warmth and grandeur of Ashcombe Hall contrasted sharply with the growing sense of confinement. Doors, though still functional, seemed to represent barriers as much as entryways. Guests began to murmur in low, nervous tones, retreating to corners or clustering in small groups. Conversations, previously light and polite, now carried the subtle weight of suspicion. Poirot, with his unerring attention to human behavior, observed every movement and gesture with meticulous care. The isolation, he understood, would do one of two things. It would either amplify fear, revealing hidden anxieties, or force truth from those who could no longer escape scrutiny. Isolation, he murmured softly to himself, fingers steepled under his chin, is a most instructive companion. It sharpens both fear and truth. Guests wandered the halls, their footsteps muffled by thick rugs, eyes darting nervously at corners where shadows seemed to gather with uncanny intent. Miss Clara Withers, always poised, now seemed slightly tense. The delicate composure she maintained earlier had given way to an almost imperceptible rigidity. Mrs. Worthington, ever sharp and inquisitive, whispered in rapid undertones to Lady Eleanor, their heads bent so closely together that Poirot could only catch the occasional gesture, a pointed finger, a brief shake of the head, a frown that creased the widow's usually controlled features. Reginald Ashcombe paced in the library, his long strides betraying restlessness. His eyes occasionally flicked to the window, watching the blizzard's furious dance, yet they also scanned the room in calculated observation. Victor Langley lingered near the hearth, adjusting his cufflinks and straightening his tie as if to assert control over a situation increasingly beyond his command. Even Mr. Julian Pritchard, whose wealth and confidence had earlier exuded ease, now avoided direct eye contact, the slight quiver in his fingers betraying a nervous energy that his polished exterior could not conceal. Poirot moved through the room deliberately, noting small details that others overlooked. A glove abandoned on a side table, a faint smear on a silver tray, a tilt in a chair as though someone had been interrupted mid-motion. All were pieces in the intricate mosaic of human behavior. Each gesture, each hesitation, each glance carried meaning, and Poirot's mind catalogued them, storing them for careful examination. The storm outside intensified, and with it, the realization among the guests that no one could leave. The initial excitement of a winter evening had been replaced by a subtle, simmering anxiety. Whispers of what if and could it be rose and fell like gusts of wind, unchecked by reason. Poirot, seated quietly in a high-backed chair near the hearth, sipped his tea and observed, noting how the constraints of the environment began to strip away polite facades. In one corner, Miss Withers approached Dr. Mills, her voice soft yet probing. "Do you truly believe it was mere faintness, or could something else, something deliberate, have caused Mr. Carlyle's fall?" Poirot's eyebrow arched ever so slightly, Even in casual inquiry, subtle revelations surfaced. Fear, curiosity, suspicion, they were threads that could lead to truth if handled with care. Across the room, Victor Langley attempted to maintain decorum, clapping his hands lightly to draw attention and gently urging conversation. Yet Poirot noticed the way his shoulders tightened, the occasional dart of his eyes towards certain guests, the subtle signs of a man conscious of the delicate balance he must maintain. Lady Eleanor, ever perceptive, seemed to understand the psychological game unfolding, her calm exterior belying the careful control with which she managed each conversation. Poirot's own reflections were precise, his little grey cells assembling possibilities with deliberate care. He considered the sequence of events, the toast, Henry Carlisle's sudden collapse, the rising tension among the guests, and now the enforced isolation by the snowstorm. Each factor was interconnected. Isolation magnified every subtle fissure in human behavior, exposing vulnerabilities, prejudices, and perhaps even motives previously concealed under social grace. He walked slowly along the corridor, the thick carpets muffling his steps, pausing at each door to glance into rooms where guests had retreated. A faint light from a candelabra illuminated Mrs. Worthington's anxious hands as she adjusted a folded letter she held tightly. In the library, Reginald's reflection shimmered in the glass of a tall bookcase, his fingers drumming lightly against a leather-bound volume, a gesture almost imperceptible but revealing unease. Poirot paused, fingers interlaced behind his back, and considered the psychological dynamics now at play. In such confined circumstances, ordinary civility would give way to instinct. Lies would slip, secrets would surface, and fear, like water through a sieve, would escape in unpredictable ways. Every glance, every hesitation, every misstep now mattered infinitely, more than it would have in the openness of the outside world. As evening deepened, and the storm raged on, the guests gradually settled into reluctant acceptance of their confinement. They gathered in small groups by the hearth or near the windows, their conversations muted, cautious. Laughter occasionally broke the tension, but Poirot noticed it was forced, a delicate mask over a layer of apprehension. He reflected on human nature, as he often did. In isolation, the masks fall. The true self, unguarded and raw, emerges. The country house, now sealed by the snowstorm, was no longer merely a location. It had become a crucible, pressing, testing, revealing. Poirot's mind worked tirelessly, tracking every detail, every movement, and every reaction, knowing that soon the threads of observation would intertwine into clarity. At the center of it all, Poirot remained calm, poised and alert. In the quiet of the storm, he could hear the almost inaudible rhythm of human anxiety, the soft shuffle of feet, the tapping of fingers, the faint hiss of breath through tense lips. Each sound, each movement, each expression was a note in the intricate symphony of behavior, and Poirot, as always, was attuned to it all. Isolation, he repeated, silently to himself, sharpens both fear and truth. In this snowbound estate, the truth was beginning to emerge. Not all guests were what they seemed. Not all motives were transparent. And for Henry Carlisle, whose sudden fall had started this chain of events, the consequences of hidden tensions were only beginning to unfold. The storm continued its relentless march, each flake a reminder of the walls that enclosed them. Inside Ashcombe Hall, the guests faced the pressing reality. They were trapped together with secrets, suspicions, and the quiet, piercing presence of a detective whose little grey cells had already begun their inexorable work. Chapter 5. Hidden Motives. The morning after Henry Carlisle's sudden collapse dawned pale and grey, filtered through the frost-encrusted windows of Ashcombe Hall. The storm outside had waned to a steady drizzle, but the estate remained trapped in an eerie stillness, as though the snow itself had slowed the pulse of the world. Guests moved quietly through the hallways, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous spaces, careful to avoid the pooling puddles of melted ice on polished floors. For many, the night had been restless, filled with unspoken thoughts and private speculations. For Hercule Poirot, it had been a night of meticulous reflection, his little grey cells working tirelessly to untangle the web of human intention that now enveloped Ashcombe Hall. Henry Carlisle, for all his outward appearance of affable composure, had never been without enemies. Poirot's observations the previous evening had hinted at tension among the assembled guests, and now, in the clear light of day, these tensions revealed themselves more fully, like shadows stretching under the sun. Business disputes, old grudges, and simmering jealousy, all previously cloaked by the veneer of polite conversation, had left subtle traces in behavior, posture, and expression. Margaret Carlisle, Henry's younger sister, moved through the corridors with a calm that bordered on eerie. Her features, delicate and precise, betrayed little emotion, yet Poirot had observed in the dining hall a subtle, almost imperceptible relief in her posture when her brother had collapsed. She had clasped her hands together, her lips pressed tightly, and a small exhalation had escaped her nostrils, almost like a sigh of freedom. Poirot noted this quietly, cataloguing the observation with the precision of a jeweler examining a gem. Relief at one's sibling's sudden vulnerability, even if hidden, was a thread worth following. Jonathan Pritchard, Henry's business partner, was a man whose pallor had deepened overnight. His usually assured step faltered slightly as he crossed the main hall, and his eyes darted repeatedly toward Henry, flickering with an anxiety that did not fully belong to concern for a colleague's health. Poirot, ever attentive to the nuances of human expression, recognized that Jonathan's pallor was not merely the result of shock, it was the manifestation of guilt, fear, or perhaps a more complex entanglement of both. Even the servants who moved quietly to prepare breakfast and attend to minor duties seemed uneasy. They lingered near the peripheries of rooms, avoiding the hearth where Henry now sat in a high-backed chair, wrapped in a warm blanket and sipping a weak infusion of tea. Their heads were bowed slightly, voices muted, movements deliberate. Poirot, whose gaze rarely missed detail, noted that the butler, Mr. Cranfield, was unusually fidgety when delivering a tray of toast, his eyes flitting toward the group of guests, as if expecting some unspoken accusation. The staff, Poirot realized, were not merely servants. They were witnesses, perhaps guardians of hidden knowledge, their silence a reflection of loyalties, fear, or discretion. Poirot himself moved with quiet deliberation, his cane tapping lightly against the polished floor. He began his inquiries with gentle precision, approaching each guest in turn, observing the manner of their speech, the subtle tension in their hands, the cadence of their breathing. "Madame Carlisle," he began softly, addressing Margaret, "yesterday's event must have caused considerable alarm. How do you find him this morning?" Margaret's response was measured, her tone calm, almost rehearsed. "He is resting, Monsieur Poirot. The doctor assures me he will recover fully." "I am relieved. He is unharmed, of course." Yet Poirot's sharp eye detected the slight narrowing of her eyelids and the faint tension in her jaw, a contradiction to the calmness of her voice. Relief, yes, but also a measure of something else, something unspoken. Turning to Jonathan Pritchard, Poirot adopted a gentler, more probing tone. "And you, Monsieur Pritchard, were you not concerned for Mr. Carlisle?" Jonathan shifted uneasily, glancing at the others, before returning his gaze to Poirot. "Of course I was concerned," he said, voice tight. "But there are matters of business that cannot wait. One cannot ignore obligations entirely, even for a moment of personal distress." Poirot noted the subtle defensiveness in his phrasing, the quick correction of his stance, the avoidance of eye contact. "Obligations," he mused quietly, "often serve as convenient veils for more pressing personal motives." The interplay of human emotion and hidden intent fascinated Poirot. Here, in this snowbound country house, he saw a spectrum of reactions: relief thinly veiled, fear carefully masked, curiosity disguised as polite inquiry. Each layer was a potential clue, each subtle deviation from expected behavior a signpost pointing toward the truth. Poirot then turned his attention to the other guests. Mrs. Worthington, whose keen intelligence often masked itself under social grace, watched interactions with deliberate patience. Her glances, fleeting but precise, seemed to measure each response, each hesitation. Miss Withers, by contrast, approached conversation with a subtle strategic intent, her questions veiled in politeness, yet probing for vulnerability. Even Victor Langley, ostensibly the host, displayed undercurrents of anxiety, a careful modulation of tone and posture that suggested the weight of responsibility and perhaps knowledge of matters others had yet to suspect. Poirot moved among them, his presence calm but commanding, observing the subtle gestures that betrayed character. A hand brushing nervously across a table, a shift in posture when questioned, a slight tremor in the voice. All were pieces of a puzzle that would, when assembled, reveal far more than a simple fainting incident. He noted particularly the interactions surrounding the hearth, where Henry now rested. The room seemed to hold its breath, each guest conscious of proximity, of what might be said, and of what must remain unspoken. Poirot, with his unerring sense of human behavior, understood that motives, when layered beneath civility, often emerge most clearly when observed under stress. The snowstorm outside, the collapse, the isolation. Each element was a catalyst, stripping away the superficiality of polite manners and revealing the latent truths beneath. Poirot's thoughts wandered to the previous night's observations. The faint tremors in Mr. Pritchard's hand, the relief on Margaret's face, the subtle calculation in Miss Wither's eyes, the restrained tension of Lady Eleanor, the silent watchfulness of the servants, all were threads in an intricate tapestry, and he knew that behind the civility of Ashcombe Hall lay motives waiting for the proper moment to surface. Business rivalries, old grudges, jealousies, unspoken ambitions, each layered upon the next, forming a complex network of human intent. As the day wore on, Poirot engaged in discreet conversations, observing speech patterns, carefully noting contradictions and nuances. He spoke briefly with the servants, not to interrogate, but to gauge the subtleties of loyalty and fear that permeated their conduct. He observed the placement of objects, the smallest details in Henry's room, the slight disarray that hinted at disturbances invisible to a casual observer. Every action, every gesture was a clue. By mid-afternoon. The psychological landscape of the household had become apparent. Isolation, Poirot realized, had intensified the underlying tensions. Guests could no longer rely on distance or distractions. They were confined with one another, and by extension, with their own secrets. Fear and ambition had sharpened the edges of civility, revealing cracks that might, under the right circumstances, fracture completely. Poirot, seated once again by the hearth, allowed his mind to roam over these observations. He catalogued the evidence of human emotion, the relief of Margaret, the tension of Jonathan, the strategic curiosity of Miss Withers, the piercing calculation of Mrs. Worthington, the controlled anxiety of Victor Langley, the watchfulness of the servants. Each layer of motivation was distinct, yet interconnected, forming a subtle lattice upon which the forthcoming mystery would unfold. He sipped his tea thoughtfully, noting that in Ashcombe Hall, as in life, motives were rarely simple. Beneath every smile lay calculation, beneath every polite gesture, a concealed agenda, and in this snowbound estate, with tensions heightened and secrets primed to emerge, Poirot understood that the path to truth would be as intricate and delicate as the finest lacework. Every motive, he reflected, was layered beneath civility, and in the delicate balance of Ashcombe Hall, it would be his task to untangle them, to discern the threads of intention from the fabric of politeness, and to bring to light the hidden forces that had shaped the night's sudden events. Chapter 6. The champagne clue, the morning light, was pale, filtered through frost, laced windows, as if the snowstorm had left the world washed in muted silver. In the quiet of Ashcombe Hall, the grandeur of the estate now felt suffocating. The previous night's celebration had long ended, but its aftermath lingered like a dense, invisible fog. Guests moved with subdued caution, their conversations hushed, glances furtive, as though they half expected Henry Carlisle's sudden collapse to recur, or to herald further catastrophe. Poirot, however, was anything but subdued. Seated in the high-backed armchair he had claimed near the hearth, he held the remnants of Henry's champagne glass delicately between his fingers. His little grey cells were already at work, dissecting not only the actions of the previous night, but the very substance in front of him. To the ordinary eye, it was a simple glass, empty save for a few residual drops of sparkling wine. But to Poirot, it was a window into human intention, a vessel containing far more than liquid. He sniffed delicately, as one might examine a rare vintage, and a faint but peculiar scent tickled his senses. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to a trained nose, a faint bitterness, overlaid with a chemical sharpness that did not belong to champagne. Poirot's eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in anticipation. Such details, he knew, were deliberate breadcrumbs left by human error, small signals from those who believed themselves clever, yet overlooked the most essential truth. "Ah, messieurs et mesdames," he murmured softly, more to himself than anyone else. "The truth, as always, hides in the smallest gestures, in the minutest of details. The glass," he tapped it gently, "speaks volumes." Poirot's gaze swept across the room, taking in the subtle reactions of the guests. Miss Withers, who had been standing near the sideboard, froze imperceptibly. Her eyes flickered toward Poirot, then away, a small tightening of her jaw betraying concern or guilt. Mrs. Worthington, conversely, appeared outwardly unruffled, though her fingers drummed lightly against the table, a rhythm almost imperceptible, but decidedly anxious. Margaret Carlisle, seated near the hearth, folded her hands over her lap with practiced composure, yet the faintest flush colored her pale cheeks. Poirot's attention returned to the glass. He noted the fingerprints carefully left along the stem, smooth but telling. Only one person, he deduced, had handled it deliberately before Henry had taken his fatal sip. Or near fatal, he reminded himself mentally. The subtle angles of the prints suggested familiarity and caution, a hand trained in precision. Someone had ensured that the liquid would pass unnoticed, that the gesture would blend seamlessly into the ordinary conviviality of a toast. Walking slowly among the assembled guests, Poirot held the glass aloft, letting the afternoon light illuminate its contours. "Notice," he said softly, "the absence of disturbance in the liquid, the way it settled despite the sudden collapse of our unfortunate friend. There is intention here, precision, a hand accustomed to control." Victor Langley, standing near the window, shifted uncomfortably. "You mean someone tampered with it?" His voice trembled, betraying more than he intended. Poirot's gaze, small and precise, settled on him for a heartbeat before moving to others. "Not so fast, Monsieur Langley. Let us not leap to conclusions. But we must consider carefully, if this glass has been manipulated, who could have had opportunity, and who possesses the skill to act without detection?" The room seemed to contract slightly under Poirot's observation. The guests, previously relaxed in their polite restraint, now became acutely aware that every gesture, every glance, every subtle movement might betray them. Mr. Pritchard, who had been speaking quietly with Dr. Mills, faltered mid-word, his eyes darting toward the sideboard, as though seeking reassurance that no one had observed him. Miss Withers' lips pressed together, and she took a small, almost imperceptible step backward, creating a deliberate distance between herself and the table. Poirot continued to examine the glass with careful precision. He noted the subtle residue along the rim, the way it clung in microscopic threads. To the untrained eye, it was nothing. To Poirot, it was evidence of deliberate handling, a trace of human intent left behind, like a signature. He considered the sequence of events in his mind, the toast, the careful lifting of the glass, the sudden collapse. Each element was a piece of a complex puzzle, and this glass was the key to unlocking it. "Observe," he said softly, addressing no one in particular, "the gestures of the person who last touched this glass. A simple action, easily missed, yet it reveals more than 100 words could. Intention, subtlety, and opportunity are all laid bare." Poirot's eyes swept the room again. Each guest reacted, whether consciously or unconsciously. Margaret, her hands still folded in her lap, shifted slightly, a faint exhale escaping her lips. Jonathan Pritchard cleared his throat, straightened his shoulders, but the color in his face was uneven, suggesting internal calculation. Mrs. Worthington, ever composed, did not move, yet her eyes, sharp and piercing, followed every subtle gesture Poirot made with calculated precision. It was the smallest details, Poirot knew, that ultimately exposed the grandest schemes. The careful tilt of a head, the slight pause before answering a question, the gentle rearrangement of objects on a tray, all were part of a choreography meant to disguise truth. But truth, as always, leaves traces. It is a scent, a shadow, a fingerprint, something to be noticed by the vigilant observer. Poirot finally set the glass on the table, fingers lingering on its rim. His eyes, calm and deliberate, scanned the room once more. "Every action has a consequence," he said softly, "and every gesture betrays intent, even if the mind believes it concealed. Here, we have a most instructive clue, a glass, a sip, and the faintest trace of interference. From such minute evidence, we shall uncover the wider truth. Ah, but patience. The little grey cells must examine, consider, and reconstruct, and only then will the full story be revealed." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their polite facades beginning to crack under the weight of Poirot's quiet authority. The realization that the champagne glass, something so ordinary, so seemingly benign, might have been a vessel of intent unsettled them. Murmurs rose quietly, and glances flicked from person to person, subtle accusations passing like shadows across the walls. Poirot, however, remained serene, seated comfortably by the hearth. To him, the chaos of suspicion, the tension in the room, the flickers of fear and calculation, these were merely data points, each one a thread leading to the truth. The champagne, once a symbol of celebration, had become a key. The gestures meant to be unnoticed had revealed more than the casual observer could perceive, and Poirot, ever precise, was ready to follow those traces wherever they led. In Ashcombe Hall, amidst the grandeur and the frost, bitten isolation, the stage had been set. The champagne glass, subtle and ordinary, had spoken, and the truth, patiently waiting in shadows and gestures, would soon step into the light. Chapter 7. Conversations in the hall, the grand hall of Ashcombe House, usually a stage for laughter and refined gatherings, now carried a quieter, more deliberate energy. The heavy curtains were drawn to keep out the lingering cold, and the hearth blazed, casting flickering light across the polished floors and towering bookcases. The snowstorm had abated, leaving only a thick, frozen silence outside. But within the estate, another storm quietly brewed, a storm of suspicion, concealed emotions, and human secrets slowly surfacing. Guests moved in small, scattered clusters, speaking in hushed tones that barely carried over the soft crackle of the fire. There was no overt alarm. The collapse of Henry Carlisle had been resolved, yet the residual tension lingered like a fine mist. Each guest's demeanor was carefully controlled, gestures minimal, voices modulated. Even in the seemingly casual murmurs, Poirot could detect the subtleties of unease, the tiny tremors of fingers, the flutter of eyes, the faint flushes of skin that betrayed emotions otherwise hidden. Poirot sat comfortably in a high-backed chair, cane resting across his lap, observing with his usual meticulous precision. To the untrained eye, he appeared merely contemplative, perhaps even disengaged. Yet every flick of an eyelid, every shifting posture, and every whispered word was being catalogued in the masterful compartments of his mind. The little grey cells, as he so often called them, were at work, connecting past observations with present nuances, searching for the inconsistencies that would illuminate hidden motives. He began with Margaret Carlisle, who stood near the mantelpiece, speaking softly to Mrs. Worthington. Their conversation appeared innocuous to anyone else, but Poirot noted every carefully chosen word, every pause, every fleeting glance. Margaret's tone was measured, almost rehearsed, yet her eyes occasionally darted toward her brother's chair by the hearth, betraying a faint relief that her composure could not mask. The slight curl of her lips at a minor joke, the subtle relaxation of her shoulders when attention shifted. These were small signals, but they mattered immensely to Poirot, who understood that human behavior rarely remains perfect under stress. Mrs. Worthington, ever astute, responded with her own delicate nuances. Her fingers traced a pattern on the arm of her chair, a habit of thought, while her eyes measured the reaction of those around her. She spoke of trivialities at first, the weather, the arrangements for the next day, even the fleeting beauty of frost upon the windows. Yet beneath these observations lay a deliberate analysis. She was reading the room, testing responses, gauging the fractures in polite society. Poirot noted the subtle narrowing of her gaze whenever Jonathan Pritchard entered the periphery of her vision. The observation was fleeting, yet for Poirot it was a breadcrumb, an indicator that her mind, always calculating, had already begun connecting threads. Jonathan Pritchard, for his part, moved cautiously near the fireplace, conversing in low tones with the butler, Mr. Cranfield. His gestures, though superficially calm, betrayed micro-tremors of tension. A flick of the hand here, a glance toward Henry there, a subtle stiffening of his back, all evidence to Poirot that Jonathan's mind was actively working to cover, obscure, or manipulate perception. Even the butler's behavior was telling. He responded with measured politeness. Yet his eyes, sharp and assessing, betrayed a lingering anxiety. Every action of the household staff could provide insight into the interplay of loyalty, fear, and hidden knowledge. Poirot, as ever, listened before he spoke, allowing the guests to reveal themselves through both words and omissions. He heard Lady Eleanor recount a minor quarrel from weeks past, emphasizing details that seemed harmless but contained contradictions when compared to others' recollections. "I am certain Henry and Mr. Pritchard disagreed over the arrangement of the estate accounts," she said casually, "though I do not recall whether it was that evening or earlier that month." The subtle inconsistency piqued Poirot's attention. In his experience, such slips were never accidental, particularly when human motivation intersected with self-interest. Miss Withers contributed to the murmuring conversations, her voice soft but pointed. She recalled an odd smile Henry had given one of the guests during a recent gathering. A smile she described as fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet unsettling in its timing. Her recollection contrasted with others' memories, who insisted Henry had been in good spirits, perfectly polite, and entirely composed. Poirot noted the discrepancies, cataloguing each fragment of memory like a puzzle piece, aware that contradictions in recollection often illuminated truths that polite conversation obscured. Poirot's own contributions were minimal, strategic in nature. He asked gentle questions, allowing the guests to speak, while he observed not only their responses, but also the gestures that accompanied them, the tiny shifts of the hands, the glances that lingered too long or not long enough, the hesitation in speech that betrayed thought processes hidden beneath layers of civility. Every pause, every syllable, every micro-expression was a window into motive, a clue to human intention. Even the most seemingly inconsequential remarks carried weight. One guest mentioned a disagreement over dinner seating, recalling a minor exchange of words that, to the casual observer, seemed trivial. Yet Poirot's mind immediately connected it to a broader tapestry. The tension in last night's toast, the subtle rivalry between Jonathan and Henry, Margaret's faint relief, and Mrs. Worthington's calculating attention. Each minor incident was part of a larger narrative. Each whispered recollection, a potential key to the overarching puzzle. Poirot noticed small inconsistencies in timing as well. One account of Henry's collapse mentioned a shift of his hand. Another described a fleeting expression, yet another focused on his posture in the moment prior. These differing emphases were not accidental. Each speaker, consciously or not, had framed their memory to favor their own interpretation, their own self-image, or to deflect suspicion. Poirot catalogued these variations, understanding that truth often resides, not in the explicit statements, but in the contradictions between them. He allowed the murmured conversations to unfold around him, absorbing, analyzing, and assembling. Every smile, every frown, every twitch of an eyelid or hand was a note in the symphony of human intention. Poirot recognized patterns, who sought to dominate conversation, who avoided direct eye contact, who lingered near the periphery, who gravitated toward the hearth. Each behavior reflected personality, history, and critically potential motive. The quiet was occasionally punctuated by laughter, strained and careful, yet Poirot detected tension lurking beneath it. He noticed that some guests previously poised and composed now adopted a slightly defensive posture, crossing arms, leaning subtly backward, or shifting positions to maintain a margin of control. Others, seeking reassurance, moved closer to companions. Yet their whispers betrayed anxiety. Poirot knew that such movements, small as they were, could reveal more than pages of testimony. A sudden recollection caught Poirot's attention. Henry's fainting had occurred immediately after the last toast. He considered the timing carefully, the gestures surrounding the passing of the champagne, the slight hesitation in the hands of those who had handled the glass. In the soft murmur of conversations, Poirot sensed the invisible thread connecting gestures, recollections, and inconsistencies. One word here, one pause there, one overlooked action. Together, they formed a lattice of human intention, a map pointing toward revelation. As the afternoon wore on, Poirot allowed the conversations to continue, but he subtly guided them, posing gentle queries, encouraging guests to recount past incidents, recall subtle gestures, and describe expressions they had witnessed. Each recollection, carefully weighed against others, added another layer of clarity. The contradictions became less accidental, more deliberate, a pattern emerging from chaos, signaling motive, opportunity, and intent. By the day's end, Poirot had amassed a mental dossier of observations, odd smiles, remembered arguments, fleeting glances, hesitations, and slips of memory. Every utterance had been catalogued, referenced, and measured against subtle behavior. Even the smallest remark, the tilt of a head, the trembling of fingers, the narrowing of eyes, had become a breadcrumb leading toward the central truth. As the guests retired for the evening, still murmuring softly in hushed groups, Poirot remained near the hearth, contemplative, serene, and yet profoundly alert. The stage had been set for a revelation. The conversations of the day, subtle and inconspicuous to the casual observer, had provided him with a wealth of insight. Each word spoken, each memory recalled, and each gesture had contributed to the larger puzzle. For Poirot, nothing was trivial. Nothing went unnoticed. And in the careful assembly of these fragments, the odd smile, the recalled argument, the fleeting glance, he could sense the outlines of the truth beginning to emerge. The culprit, though not yet exposed, was revealing themselves through the patterns of human behavior that only a mind as precise and observant as Poirot's could decipher. In Ashcombe Hall, amidst flickering firelight and quiet murmurs, the game of detection had deepened. The clues were subtle, the motives hidden, but the detective's patient attention ensured that no detail, no matter how small, would be lost. The truth, he knew, often hides behind the veneer of politeness, yet it cannot resist careful observation, and Hercule Poirot, with his little grey cells ever vigilant, was ready to uncover it. Chapter 8. The confession begins. The drawing room of Ashcombe Hall had taken on a peculiar stillness by the late afternoon. The fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the polished floors and ornate furnishings. The storm outside had faded to a distant murmur, leaving only the residual hush of a snowbound estate. Inside, however, a different kind of storm was gathering, a quiet but potent tension, concentrated in the very air around Poirot and his guests. Poirot stood near the hearth, his posture erect, eyes calm, hands lightly clasped. His gaze moved deliberately across the assembled company. Each face, every glance, every measured breath was being observed with meticulous attention. The detective's presence, though composed, exerted a subtle pressure. The guests could feel it, a quiet insistence that attention could not be avoided, that every gesture might betray a hidden truth. The moment had come. Poirot, who had spent hours cataloguing gestures, contradictions, and whispered recollections, now knew with certainty who must be confronted, yet he did not rush. The approach, he reflected, must be precise, measured, and psychologically attuned. Confrontation, to be effective, required control not only of facts, but of emotion, of subtlety, of perception. He began in a soft, deliberate tone, addressing the room generally, yet allowing his eyes to settle on one person with unerring precision. "Mes amis," he said, voice calm, almost gentle. "It is often said that human intention is masked by courtesy. Yet no mask is impervious. We believe that our civility conceals our desires. Yet the little grey cells, applied with patience, discern what is otherwise hidden." A quiet stir passed through the guests. Margaret Carlisle, still pale, adjusted the folds of her dress, glancing nervously at her brother. Jonathan Pritchard, standing near the window, stiffened subtly, as if anticipating the inevitable. Miss Withers, whose demeanour had been calm and observant, now drew herself upright, eyes narrowing. Poirot's attention, however, remained fixed with an intensity that could not be evaded. He moved slowly toward the sideboard, placing one hand lightly upon it, and continued, voice gentle but deliberate. "Henry Carlisle, as you all know, possesses not only charm and generosity, but also a remarkable integrity. A man of principle, who observed what is proper and what is improper, with an almost forensic attention." He allowed a pause, letting the weight of his words settle. "And yet there are those who, in fear of exposure, act against what is right. Those who would disguise greed as courtesy and self-interest as loyalty." Poirot's gaze now fell squarely upon Jonathan Pritchard. A subtle tension passed through the room. All eyes turned toward him, though Poirot's demeanour was calm, almost conversational. "Monsieur Pritchard," he said, voice soft but precise, "you are aware that last night's toast was, in appearance, an ordinary gesture of celebration, yet the truth is more nuanced. A small act, perfectly timed, can transform an innocent ritual into a lethal opportunity." Jonathan's lips parted, as if to protest, but no sound emerged. His fingers twitched, betraying the composure he had so carefully maintained throughout the day. Poirot advanced another step, calm, deliberate, unhurried, each movement measured to maintain psychological dominance without overt aggression. "You see," Poirot continued, "Henry Carlisle discovered something that, if revealed, would have imperiled certain fortunes, ruined reputations, perhaps even ended livelihoods. A fraud cleverly hidden, yet detectable to a discerning eye. And the consequences of discovery were, for one individual, intolerable." Poirot's gaze did not waver, precise and piercing. "Monsieur Pritchard, you understand, do you not, that Henry's collapse was not mere coincidence, that the toast, which seemed so genuine, concealed an intent entirely different from its appearance?" The silence in the room became palpable, dense as fog. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, the tension almost visible in the space between them. Even Margaret's slight sigh of relief had become tense, wary, as if she too sensed the gravity of the revelation. Poirot allowed the pause to linger. Then, with measured calm, he recounted the sequence of events as he had reconstructed them. The careful handling of Henry's champagne glass, the faint chemical trace, the precise timing, the subtle gestures that no casual observer had noticed. Each detail was delivered without accusation, simply as fact, yet the cumulative effect was undeniable. A pattern that the careful observer can read as plainly as words on a page. And from these traces, the truth emerges. Jonathan Pritchard, his pallor now evident, finally spoke, voice tight and brittle. You think I?" His words faltered. He swallowed, his hands clenching at his sides. Poirot's gaze remained unwavering, patient, gentle yet insistent. "Yes, monsieur," Poirot said softly. "The evidence, coupled with the circumstances, leaves only one reasonable conclusion. The action, motivated by fear and self-interest, led to Mr. Carlisle's sudden collapse. The toast itself was genuine, yet the intent behind it, I regret to say, was lethal." Jonathan's head lowered, the fight leaving him. The confession began, not as a dramatic outburst, but as a quiet unraveling. I did not intend to," he murmured, words breaking under the weight of exposure. "I only meant to frighten him, to prevent the discovery of the accounts. It was a small intervention. I thought I could manage. Poirot nodded slightly, allowing the confession to continue. His mind catalogued the precise details, noting the inconsistencies in Jonathan's phrasing, the selective admission of acts, the carefully framed explanation. Each nuance was significant, a piece of the puzzle, a thread connecting motive, opportunity, and method. "Indeed, Monsieur Pritchard," Poirot said gently, "we understand intention and effect are not always aligned, yet your actions have consequences, whether foreseen or not. And the law, as well as morality, must account for both." The room remained hushed. Guests absorbed the confession with varying expressions: horror, disbelief, relief, or a cold satisfaction at justice being revealed. Margaret sat rigid, fingers clasped tightly. Mrs. Worthington observed with analytical precision. Miss Wither's lips pressed in thought, her mind undoubtedly racing through implications. Victor Langley's brow furrowed, the weight of responsibility pressing visibly upon him. Poirot allowed a final pause before concluding. "The lesson, my friends, is simple. Intention, however concealed, is never entirely hidden. A gesture, a touch, a sip. These may appear insignificant, yet they are sufficient to reveal the truth to the discerning eye. And in this case, it was sufficient to bring the matter before us all, and to ensure that justice, tempered by understanding, may be served." Jonathan's shoulders slumped fully. The confession, delicate yet devastating, had begun its unfolding. He had intended to conceal, to manipulate, yet human observation, subtle evidence, and the careful reasoning of Hercule Poirot had unmasked him. The quiet room, once filled with polite murmurs, now contained the unmistakable clarity of truth emerging from the shadows. And Poirot, serene as ever, knew the revelation was not yet complete. Further questions remained, nuances to clarify, and the full extent of the consequences to unfold. But the first stone had been turned. The confession had begun. Chapter 9. Truth at Dawn. The first light of dawn broke over Ashcombe Hall, soft and muted, as though the snow-laden world had absorbed the turmoil of the night. The snowstorm, which had transformed the countryside into a glittering, silent expanse, now lay quiet, the drifts smooth and unbroken except for the occasional footfall of servants and guests beginning to stir. Outside, the air was crisp and crystalline, each breath visible in the cold, clear light. Inside, the hall retained the lingering tension of recent events, though a calm had begun to settle, subtle yet pervasive. Hercule Poirot sat in his usual armchair near the hearth, his posture impeccable, his small grey eyes observing with serene precision. A cup of coffee, dark and aromatic, steamed gently in his hands, yet he barely sipped, for his mind was already reviewing every fragment of the preceding hours. The chaos of the collapse, the subtle interactions of the guests, the painstaking deductions. The little grey cells had, as always, passed every detail, separating truth from deception with meticulous care. The snow softened the edges of the estate, yet it could not obscure the fractures revealed within its walls. The previous evening had demonstrated how delicate the balance between civility and deceit truly was. Guests now moved quietly through the corridors, each lost in contemplation, reflecting on the night's revelations. Some lingered near the windows, gazing at the winter landscape, while others sat in small clusters by the fireplace, speaking only in subdued tones. There was a shared understanding among them. The thin line between trust and betrayal, once crossed, cannot easily be forgotten. The authorities had arrived as the sun began to climb, summoned by the careful communication of Poirot and Victor Langley. 2 detectives from the local constabulary had come, a quiet efficiency in their movements. Yet their arrival caused little disruption. Jonathan Pritchard, the culprit whose motives had been exposed, remained subdued, seated near the library, where he could no longer escape observation. The look on his face was one of resignation, mingled with the faintest trace of relief, the release that comes with truth spoken and the inevitability of justice acknowledged. Poirot's gaze swept the room, taking in the guests and their varied reactions. Margaret Carlisle sat near the hearth, her hands folded, her composure returned, but her expression reflective, as if silently reconciling relief with lingering unease. Mrs. Worthington, ever observant, appeared to study the others, noting their subtle shifts, the faint relief, mingled with restrained suspicion, the delicate recalibration of social dynamics, now that the immediate danger had passed. Miss Withers, quiet, yet sharp, had taken up a corner by the window, her eyes distant, contemplating the intricate interplay of human nature that had been so clearly revealed. Victor Langley, though outwardly composed, had a faint crease between his brows, a subtle acknowledgement of the responsibility he bore. He had hosted the gathering, unwittingly facilitated the circumstances, and now witnessed the restoration of order under the vigilant mind of Hercule Poirot. The country house, once a place of laughter and conviviality, had become an arena for hidden motives, subtle manipulations, and the exercise of justice. Poirot, sipping his coffee with delicate precision, reflected upon the sequence of events that had led to this quiet morning. The collapse at the stroke of midnight, the carefully concealed intentions, the faint chemical trace on the champagne glass, the inconsistencies in recollection, and finally, the confession. Each step had been methodical, observed, and understood. And yet, he knew that the resolution was not merely about the identification of wrongdoing. It was about the restoration of moral order, the subtle recalibration of human affairs that justice entails. As he sat, he considered the psychological lessons of the night. Human beings, under pressure, reveal their true selves not only through grand gestures, but also through the smallest, most inconspicuous details. A tremor of the hand, a shift in posture, a hesitation in speech, or the way one regards another with the faintest flicker of emotion. The guests, in their polite conversations and careful interactions, had inadvertently betrayed their internal landscapes, offering Poirot the breadcrumbs necessary to reconstruct the truth. The authorities, now fully briefed, moved with quiet efficiency. They reviewed the evidence carefully, the champagne glass with its subtle residue, the documented sequence of gestures observed by Poirot, the statements of each guest, juxtaposed against the inconsistencies and contradictions Poirot had meticulously recorded. All details, while seemingly ordinary in isolation, collectively confirmed the narrative that had already emerged through Poirot's deductions. The culprit, Jonathan Pritchard, was escorted gently but firmly for formal questioning. He walked with measured steps, subdued yet composed, aware that his actions had been unmasked, and that the consequences, both legal and social, were inevitable. Even as he left, the tension in the room lingered, a reminder that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, the implications of human duplicity could not vanish so easily. Poirot observed quietly, his demeanor calm, yet his mind still active. He noted the subtle recalibration of behavior among the remaining guests. Margaret's hands relaxed slightly in her lap, yet her gaze occasionally flickered toward the hallway where her brother sat. Mrs. Worthington's eyes, sharp and calculating, assessed the residual dynamics of the household. Miss Withers' contemplative posture suggested inward reflection on human vulnerability and the delicate balance of trust. The room, though physically restored to order, now carried a lingering sense of awareness. The guests, who had once taken comfort in the predictability of civility, now understood the fragility of appearances. Even a single, well-timed action, intentional or accidental, could disrupt the social equilibrium, revealing hidden ambitions, fears and desires. Poirot, as ever, understood this intimately. The little grey cells discerned patterns invisible to others, extracting meaning from nuance and exposing the fundamental truths that governed human conduct. Victor Langley, approaching Poirot quietly, offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Monsieur Poirot," he said softly, "I do not know how you always see what others cannot. The house, the people, everything has shifted. Yet the truth stands clear." Poirot inclined his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "It is not a matter of seeing, Monsieur Langley. It is a matter of observing, of listening, of patience. One must pay attention to the subtleties, the gestures, the omissions, the inconsistencies. Truth is like a fragile crystal. It reflects, refracts, and ultimately reveals itself to the vigilant eye. The morning light strengthened, casting longer shadows across the polished floorboards. Outside, the snow, soft and unbroken, glimmered as if forgiving the transgressions of the previous night. Yet inside Ashcombe Hall, the moral landscape had shifted irrevocably. The culprit had been identified, justice had begun its course, and the intricate dance of human motives had been laid bare. Poirot sipped the last of his coffee, satisfied in the restoration of order and the clarity of truth. He understood that even the first dawn of the year, however serene and promising, could not undo the events of the past night. Consequences had been set into motion, and human nature, with all its frailty and complexity, had revealed itself fully. As the guests quietly moved to attend to morning routines, Poirot remained near the hearth, reflecting on the delicate interplay of intention, action, and consequence. The snow outside softened the estate's edges, yet the lessons within its walls were etched indelibly into memory: the thin line between trust and betrayal, the subtlety of human deception, and the inexorable clarity of careful observation. Ashcombe Hall, for all its grandeur and tranquility, had borne witness to the revelation of human truths. And Hercule Poirot, seated serenely, coffee in hand, knew that justice, tempered with insight, had prevailed, not through force, but through intellect, observation, and the quiet power of reason. Chapter 10. Coffee and reflection. The morning sun had climbed higher, though pale winter light still filtered through frost-laced windows, lending Ashcombe Hall an ethereal glow. The snow outside had softened the sharp contours of the estate, blanketing the grounds in white silence. Within the walls of the house, however, a different warmth had settled, a warmth born not merely of the crackling hearth, but of truth revealed and order restored. I sat across from Hercule Poirot at the library table, my own cup of coffee steaming gently before me. Its aroma mingled with the lingering scent of polished wood and faint traces of last night's champagne, a sensory reminder of the events that had unfolded in the country house. Poirot, small, precise, and elegantly composed, held his cup delicately, as if even the simple act of drinking were a ritual requiring careful attention. He spoke first, his voice calm, deliberate, and imbued with that quiet authority that always compelled attention. "Monday, Ami," he began. "The evening we have observed, though seemingly ordinary in its festive intention, has revealed, as often is the case, the fragility and complexity of human nature. One simple toast, innocuous to the casual eye, has uncovered motives, fears, and ambitions that might otherwise have remained hidden." I leaned back slightly, listening to the cadence of his words, noticing the deliberate pauses he allowed for reflection. Poirot's reflections were never mere commentary. They were a reconstruction of events, an unveiling of the intricate architecture of human behavior, a masterclass in reasoning and observation. "The first act," Poirot continued, "was Henry Carlisle's toast at the stroke of midnight. To all, a gesture of celebration; to one individual, a precipice of opportunity. The glass itself," he gestured subtly to the now empty vessel on the side table, "was handled with deliberate care, the faint chemical trace, the precise fingerprints, all elements revealing intention, disguised as courtesy." Poirot's eyes, sharp and discerning, swept the room before settling upon me with a gentle intensity. "And yet, my friend, the human element is never as mechanical as evidence alone suggests. One must consider emotion, calculation, fear, and the constraints of social performance. Each guest, each observer, contributed to the tapestry of action and reaction. Their gestures, their hesitations, their recollections, even the seemingly trivial, served as threads which, when woven together, reveal the entire design." I nodded slowly, recalling the hushed conversations by the fire, the subtle glances, the odd smiles, and the slips of memory that had so captivated Poirot. He had been observing not only actions but the psychology beneath them: fear hidden as loyalty, ambition disguised as concern, relief masked as composure. Poirot leaned slightly forward, the little grey cells behind his eyes gleaming with intellectual satisfaction. "Monsieur Pritchard," he said quietly, "acted out of fear of exposure, motivated by personal loss disguised as social fidelity. Yet intention, no matter how well concealed, leaves traces. The gestures, the timing, the subtle hesitations, all these betray the mind's hidden workings. We, with careful observation, see the otherwise invisible. I took another sip of coffee, warm and comforting, the bitter sweetness matching the complexity of the revelations that had unfolded. Poirot's voice continued, low and deliberate, recounting the sequence of events with surgical precision. Each detail, every gesture, pause, glance, and word, was contextualized, interlinked, and finally rendered intelligible. The confession, when it came, was not dramatic, Poirot explained. It was quiet, subtle, and inevitable. Human conscience, when confronted with incontrovertible evidence, seeks resolution. The perpetrator, though initially intent upon concealment, was gradually led to acknowledge the truth, guided not by force, but by reason, observation, and moral clarity. I glanced at the other guests, still lingering in the library, their expressions a mixture of contemplation, relief, and quiet unease. Margaret Carlisle sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, a faint flush lingering in her cheeks despite the restored composure. Mrs. Worthington, ever observant, seemed to measure the implications of human behavior for her own understanding. Miss Withers remained contemplative, a slight smile playing upon her lips as she reflected on the patterns of human intention she had witnessed. Even Victor Langley, usually composed and confident, had a faint crease between his brows, a subtle acknowledgement of the fragility of trust and the responsibility borne by the host. Poirot set down his coffee and tapped a finger lightly upon the table. Monday, Ami, it is remarkable how celebrations can reveal more than they conceal. One moment of cheer, one sip of champagne, one gesture unnoticed by all but the vigilant eye. These are the instruments by which truth emerges. And yet, we must remember, the human condition is complex. Greed, fear, loyalty, and kindness exist side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. I found myself reflecting on the night's events, understanding the delicate balance Poirot had described, the collapse of Henry Carlisle, the careful observation of every guest, the reconstruction of actions and motives, the confession of the culprit. All of it formed a narrative that was as instructive as it was chilling. Even a moment intended for celebration had become a crucible, revealing the finest and most flawed elements of human character. The estate, Poirot continued, voice soft and reflective, has witnessed these events. Its walls, its corridors, even the hearth around which we have gathered, hold the memory of human frailty and brilliance alike. And though time may pass, the lessons remain. Vigilance, observation, and moral discernment are ever necessary companions to reason. I nodded again, considering the subtle interplay of intention and consequence. Poirot had reminded me that nothing is truly hidden, not even the smallest gesture, if observed carefully, patiently, and with the insight to discern the meaning beneath appearances. Some celebrations, Poirot said finally, lifting his cup in a quiet gesture, bring cheer. Others, though marked by festivity, remind us of our imperfection. And always, one must observe, think, and apply reason, for it is in these observations, these careful reflections, that justice, tempered with understanding, prevails. I mirrored his gesture, raising my own coffee in silent acknowledgement of the truth now fully revealed. The warmth of the beverage, the glow of the fire, and the clarity of insight combined into a rare moment of calm reflection. Outside, the snow sparkled like 1,000 tiny diamonds, serene and untouched. Yet within the house, the story of the night had been etched indelibly in memory and moral understanding. Poirot reclined slightly, eyes closed for a brief moment in satisfaction. And now, mon ami, the year begins, and with it, new opportunities for reflection, observation, and the pursuit of truth. Yet we shall remember that even in moments of joy, vigilance must remain, for human frailty and ambition are constant companions. I finished my coffee in silence, allowing the weight of his words to settle. A single toast, one glass of champagne, had ended one life's equilibrium and exposed the hidden complexities of all those present. Yet in the quiet after revelation, there was order, understanding, and the reassurance that reason, patience, and careful observation could illuminate the darkest corners of human intent. Ashcombe Hall, once again serene in the soft light of dawn, held the story of that night within its walls. Its beauty was unchanged, but its memory was enriched with lessons of morality, justice, and the subtle patterns of human behavior. And for Hercule Poirot, seated near the hearth, coffee in hand, the work of observation, reflection, and understanding would continue, as it always would, guided by the unwavering light of reason and the ever-diligent little grey cells.